everybody. It looks like folks are coming right in. We'll start our presentation on living with bald eagles really soon. We'll just give everyone a couple more minutes to make sure that everyone can learn about eagles with us today. But thank you so much for being here with us. So it does look like folks have stopped kind of showing up, and it looks like everybody's video is off and audio is muted. And that'll just help our technology run a little bit smoother. So first of all, welcome to our continuing series of birding webinars. My name is Kelsey, and I'll be your presenter today for our webinar called Living with Bald Eagles. You can see by this very majestic eagle right here. We'll be focusing on bald eagles and how people can observe and protect them. And if this is your first time attending one of our webinars, you can catch up on all the other information we've provided on the Bird Conservancy YouTube channel. So whether you've attended all of our webinars in the past or this is your first one, I really am glad you're here and I hope you enjoy. If you have questions that come up during this webinar, please use the chat box and we'll get through your questions as they come up or at a question and answer session at the end. We're recording this webinar, so don't worry about scrambling to take notes or anything like that. It'll be up on our YouTube channel later this afternoon, evening probably, and we'll send out a link to all registered participants. And we'll also send along, relevant resources and things like that. So we are using Zoom as our platform today, and imagine about a year into this virtual world. Most of you might have used it before, but if this is your first time, no worries. So I want to point out that your video and microphone should be off or muted because it does help that technology run a little smoother. You can see that in the bottom left-hand corner. They should have red X's through them. When I'm in full screen like I am right now, your screen should be as well. If you need to exit, you can push escape or click exit full screen at the top. And if you kind of mouse over the bottom of your window, I've circled the chat button, that little speech bubble in my window. You can click on that and that should dock the chat next to the presentation. And when you do send a message, type it in, press enter, make sure that you're sending it to everyone so we can all see your input. And the chat window is how we will be interacting through this webinar. So let's give it a try. If you wouldn't mind typing in the chat where you're from, how many people are watching with you, and what your favorite bird is today. That way we can practice chatting as well as get to know each other a little bit better. We've had folks from all over the country join us recently, which has been really cool. Oh, Gunnison, that's awesome. Oh, I'd love to see a mountain bluebird. That would be amazing for today. Welcome. Oh, loggerhead shanks are so cool, Tyler. Hello from Fort Collins. Hi, Laura in Nebraska. Oh, it's so cool to see people from all over. Thank you all so much for joining us today. This is so exciting. Awesome. So a little bit more about who we are as your presenters. My name is Kelsey, and I'm the Outreach and Volunteer Coordinator for Bird Conservancy. My favorite bird today is a canvasback. It's that little funky duck on the bottom there. My mom called me last week about a weird bird in her backyard in Ohio, and we spent a good long time trying to figure out what it was, and it was a canvasback. So now I'm kind of determined to see one here in Colorado. Joining me today is Tyler Cash, our Camp and Community Coordinator. He is monitoring the chat, so he will be answering questions as well as relaying them to me at the end. And like Tyler mentioned, his favorite bird today is the loggerhead shrike. Awesome. And a little bit about Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and who we are. We are a nonprofit organization headquartered out of Brighton, Colorado. And our mission is to conserve birds and their habitat through science, stewardship, and education. Our science team is real focused on advancing knowledge, gathering data, observing birds, monitoring, things like that. Our stewardship team is real boots on the ground. They work with landowners to make sure that their land is both profitable for them, but still a really good habitat for birds. And then the education team, which I'm a part of, we're focused on connecting everybody to the outdoors using birds as that hook. And as our name would imply, we focus on conserving birds and their habitat through the entire Rockies region. So Montana, the Dakotas, all the way down through Mexico and beyond. We also get the question a lot of times, why do we want to conserve birds? We could be the spider conservancy of the Rockies if we wanted to, but we choose to focus on birds for several different reasons. And my favorite is that birds are so accessible. I can guarantee no matter where you are today, if you were to go outside or open your apartment window and observe for a little bit, you could find a little bit of nature. You could find a bird outside somewhere. And in that way, birds, are your connection to nature wherever you are. Birds are also, with their delicate constitution, really good at being indicators of environmental changes. They notice changes in the environment a lot quicker than humans do. So they can be really good indicators of when something's wrong and when we need to step in and do something. They also provide really excellent ecosystem services, such as, eat a berry, fly over there, poop out the seed, and then huzzah, we have a whole new tree. It's very exciting. They're also really helpful for pest control and things like that. They're a real vital part of the entire ecosystem. And birds are just inspirational, from art, music, the design of airplanes, things like that. Birds have really inspired us for a very long time. And we're going to be talking about our bald eagle friend today. Bald eagles are really great environmental indicators of when things are a little bit off in their environment, such as when DDT became an issue in the 60s and 70s. And they were, the bald eagles were dying off, and because the DDT was making their shells too thin. So they were kind of saying, hey, this pesticide isn't great for the environment. Let's make some changes. And bald eagles are just super inspirational. They've been our national bird since 1782. And there's a lot we can learn about them. And today we're going to be learning about their life cycles, kind of the bald eagle basics, if you will. And we'll talk about their life cycle, how they grow and what they are up to, as well as how humans play a role in their survival. So let us get right to it. Here we go. So the bald eagle is in the sea eagle family. And the other eagle that is in that family is the white-tailed eagle, which lives in the Eurasian space. They are not sexually dimorphic. The male and female both look the same. The only way to really tell them apart is by size. And yes, the females are a bit larger. In the summer here in Colorado, there's anywhere between 400 to 600 bald eagles. And in the winter, when they come together to hang out around their favorite fishing spots, we can have up to 1,200 bald eagles in the state. And I get the question a lot of, why are they called bald eagles? It's like they do have feathers on their head. They're not actually bald. But the word bald comes from the Old English word bald, B-A-L-D-E, meaning white. So they're named after a bald, white-headed eagle. So let's talk about field marks. When you first look at this eagle, what are the first things you notice? If you want to type in the chat what you notice first about these guys. And I work with kids, so I can wait a long time until you decide to type something in. What do you notice first? There's no wrong answer here. Yeah, the yellow beak. Very good. That's what I noticed too. They have a really big beak. Oh, yeah, and that he's carrying a fish. Awesome. White tail, white head, big curved beak. Absolutely. These are great observations, everybody. Yeah, they have the big yellow beak. Their beak's a bit bigger than most other raptor species. They have that white head, a dark brown body, and they have another field mark would be those yellow feet with really, really big talons, as well as a large wingspan, which is a little difficult to see in this picture. I'll give you that. So the field marks, yes, the big white head, the yellow beak, dark body. But let's talk a little bit about some other things that make a bald eagle unique. Like I mentioned, they are not sexually dimorphic, so the females are a little bit bigger. They are about 27.9 to 37.8 inches tall, which is about the height of a 2-year-old human, give or take. So they're a pretty decent sized bird. And their wingspan is up to 6.5 feet, which is crazy. That's a big bird right there. And they, because of the different sizes of the birds, like the females tend to be larger, as well as northern eagles, eagles that live up in Canada and places like that, they tend to be a bit larger than their southern friends. But they can weigh anywhere between 7 to 12 pounds. On the smaller end, 7 pounds is about the same as 2 human brains, 3 liters of water, or 20 hamsters. So if you imagine that, that's about how much that bird weighs. Or if it's a bigger eagle, that's about 12 pounds. That's like 2.5 chihuahuas, 13 soccer balls, or 16 cans of soup. So you have quite the range there. But still, for such a large bird, it still tends to be, pretty light. When I would work with raptors and do programs with them on the hand, students would always say, oh, it weighs 100 pounds, it weighs 50 pounds. And I was surprised they thought I was that strong. But no, these guys weigh not very much like most birds. They're mostly feathers and fluff that allow them to fly and be wonderful predators. So that's a little bit more about that basic. And when they're in flight, they're pretty easy to identify as well, especially as an adult. They'll have that white tail and the white head and a very prominent beak. You'll be able to see the beak while they're flying. But they have sort of thinner, straighter wings and are sometimes called a flying 2x4. And they're pretty distinctive with those straight wings when they are flying. And we know this bird is in the raptor family, has those big talons and a big beak, and that should help us learn a little bit about what they eat. Does anybody have any guesses as to what this bird might eat, what his favorite food is? Yeah, fish. Good job, Xander. Yeah, bald eagles love fish. It's their favorite thing. There we go. And there are a lot of delicious options if they get tired of fish too. Like I mentioned, they're in the raptor family. The word raptor comes from the Latin word to seize or to grab. And as you can see in the corner there, the eagle is using its feet, its big talons to hunt, which is why it's part of that raptor family. But while fish is their favorite, they're also a generalist feeder, meaning that they'll eat whatever is available, but fish is still their favorite. Of fish, they really like salmon, herring, shad, and catfish. But again, they're not very picky. They'll also eat other birds, reptiles, amphibians, invertebrates like crabs, mammals like prairie dogs or rabbits. And some of you might be wondering why there's a deer on there. Not a lot of eagles would dare to try to take down that big living deer, but they're also, they aren't picky, right? So they'll go ahead and eat roadkill or carrion as well. And it's one of the things that does threaten the bald eagle, because they'll be on the side of the road eating from a deer carcass and get hit by a car or something like that. So they're, again, generalists, not too worried about what they're eating, but some of the things they do eat can be a threat to them. And something I learned is that bald eagles will sometimes gorge themselves, meaning they'll eat a large amount of food and digest it over a couple of days. And then they can survive fasting for up to a week or two, which is kind of crazy. I know if I didn't get to eat for a week, I'd be really grouchy. And they eat so many different things and are carnivores. And that's because they have those really large talons that allow them to catch their prey. Their talons, their nails on the ends of their feet, can be up to 2 inches long. And if they were to make a fist with their foot right there, they would be able to exert about 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch on whatever they pick up, which is quite a lot of pressure. They are very strong. However, depending on lift and dive and things like that, they can only pick up and carry about 4 to 5 pounds. So if they're out there hunting and things like that, they're not going to try and pick up anything more than that. Though they have noticed, some people while observing eagles, that when an eagle will catch an extremely large fish, they can't necessarily fly with it, but they'll use their wings to kind of row or swim to shore. And I couldn't find a picture or a video of it, but I would really like to see that one day. It sounds kind of fantastic. So that is what our eagle eats. Let's talk about where our eagles live. They nest typically in forested areas by large bodies of water, and they like to stay away from heavily developed areas when possible. They like to be by those large bodies of water because they really like fish, right? They want to be able to be near a good food source. For perching and for building nests, they prefer tall, mature, coniferous, or deciduous trees. Here in Colorado, they really like the tall, mature cottonwoods, and that gives them a really good view of all of their surroundings. And in the winter, bald eagles can be seen in sort of dry, open areas and look for access to open water for fishing. They also can congregate together and can share fishing space in the winter, but they spread out to their own territories when nesting season does begin. This rather famous picture here on the right shows about 55 eagles in a tree. And this is from a photographer along the river in Washington State over one winter. So there must be really good fish somewhere nearby. But as you might notice in that picture, not all of those eagles have their white heads, right? Not all of them look bald, right? Some look a little funky. And that's because it takes about 4 to 5 years for the eagle to mature into its adult plumage. So let's talk about the different stages of that eagle's development. When a pair start building their nest, they'll work together to build the nest. The female will likely stay closer to the nest and kind of builds the nest, while the male will bring sticks and things like that along. But nests are typically 4 to 5 feet in diameter and about 2 to 4 feet tall, and they range in shape from conical. There's some that were shaped like wine glasses. They get really creative. The largest nest on record is in Florida, and it's 9.5 feet in diameter and 20 feet tall, which is crazy. And nests can weigh tons, and I mean that literally. And that's because they come back to the same nest every year. They have site fidelity, meaning they come back to the same site every year. It's their spot, it's their territory. And they add on or refurbish their nest a little bit each year. They'll line the nest with lichen or down feathers and things like that. And then once they lay the eggs, there's usually 1 to 3 eggs in each clutch. And they'll start laying these eggs in late January to March. It really depends. And they'll incubate or sit on those eggs for a little over a month, which is pretty crazy. Both the male and female will incubate the eggs, but the female does a little bit more incubating. And while one of the pair is incubating, the other one will be off hunting for both of them and bring food back to the nest. And as you can see in the middle of that picture there, the eggs are rather off-white, kind of nondescript, really kind of boring looking eggs for such an exciting bird. When the eaglets do hatch, they look like adorable little Muppets, in my opinion. I love them. When they do hatch, they're altricial, which means they are totally helpless when they're born. They're totally featherless. Their eyes are closed. They can't stand up. They can't even control their own body temperature. They depend on the parents for absolutely everything. And the other side of an altricial bird would be a precocial bird, like a duck. It's born usually on the ground with its eyes open, feathers ready to move, quacking, doing its thing. And that's mostly because, right away, those little precocial birds have to worry about predators and things like that. There's these eaglets in a pretty decent sized nest high up in a big tree. Not a lot of things are going to get there and threaten them. So for the first 12 weeks or so, they look really funny, but they're very dependent on the parents. As they're growing, eaglets grow very, very fast, and they're some of the fastest growing vertebrates in the world. They grow from about 2 ounces from when they're born to about 12 pounds in the 12 weeks before they're ready to leave the nest. They can thermoregulate or regulate their own temperature after the first 2 weeks. And that's just because they're growing so fast, you need to be able to do your own thing after a little bit. The parents will hunt and bring food back to the nest for them, and each individual eaglet will eat about 25 pounds of meat per week. And that's really, helping them grow and get really big. But eaglets are still really vulnerable at this point. They're growing so much and still largely dependent on the parents. This is when, if they're not going to survive, this is when they're going to go. But if they make it past this point, they have about a 90% chance of surviving to adulthood, which is amazing. They just have to get through the first couple weeks. Then we have the branching stage. So this is after those 12 weeks, it's grown to its full size, but it's still dependent on the parents. It is just getting out of the nest and kind of hanging out in the tree or doing what we call branching. At this point, it can't fly. It's still waiting for the parents to bring it food and things like that. But it is, able to move and is more adventurous and is kind of getting out in the world a little bit. And like I mentioned, at this point, if they get to their full size and are starting to branch, there's a 90% chance that they're going to make it to adulthood, which is pretty cool. The next stage after branching is fledging. And this is 10 to 14 weeks later. Fledging occurs when the wing muscles and feathers have developed enough to start flying, or at least practice flying. They aren't very elegant there at the beginning, but they're trying. They're still very much in the care of the parent, mostly for food. They aren't good hunters yet, and they're really awkward flyers. So if you see a young bird like this one, or one that's branching and can't quite fly, it's not in danger. A parent is still nearby and looking after it, and they'll do their best to get it back to the nest. But if they can't, they'll still come down to the ground and feed it and take care of it until it's ready to fly off on its own. And what's really neat is at this stage, when they do start fledging, bald eagles, their wings actually grow a little bit longer than that 6.5 feet. And that kind of acts as training wheels to help them learn how to fly a little bit better, which I thought was really cool. So as they grow up, their wings will get a little bit shorter than they are at this fledging stage, but that's just to help them learn. And finally, after 15 weeks of being dependent on their parents, they'll be good enough flyers, good enough hunters to fend for themselves, and they'll start dispersing around the landscape for their awkward teenage years, as I like to call that, or like years to like 4 or 5. So at this point, you can see it's a very dark bird. He doesn't have a lot of the characteristics of an adult bald eagle, right? He doesn't have that yellow beak. He doesn't have the yellow eye, the white head, the white tail. He's mostly dark brown and a little bit mottly. And I promise he's only going to get sillier. So second year bald eagles, again, variable. Birds don't read the book, so they just do what they want and grow their own way, which makes it really fun for us as we're trying to figure out, like, what bird is that, right? So that doesn't necessarily look like a bald eagle at all. They're very mottled, with a little bit of white, brown, kind of all over, but they still have, those bright yellow feet, and they will be a significant size. So this will still be bigger than most hawks we'd see and things like that. And they still have that really large beak. And that really large beak really just helps them eat fish mostly, so that they can dig in really, really well, which is one reason they have that really obnoxious beak. But during these couple of years, like their second, third, and fourth year, they're really just nomadic explorers. They can fly up to 100 miles per day, sometimes more, as they look around to find a good habitat, a great territory, and eventually a mate. So here is our second year. Let's take a look at our third year. He looks ridiculous. He has more white on his body. His beak has gotten a bit paler. He kind of has a little bit of a white head starting to happen, but he's still really mottly and still really silly looking. I think just bald eagles look rather silly until they are fully mature, and then you're like, oh, it's a bald eagle. And up to that point, you're just like, what am I looking at? But getting to know these three stages, or these different stages of being a juvenile and subadult, of like the mottledness, where the white is showing up, and how the beak and the eyes are changing, will really help you identify them out in the wild. And then we have our fourth year bald eagle. He's so close. He has a mostly white head. You can see the mostly white tail, but not completely, right? He's still got some mottling going on, but he's got that full yellow beak now, the full yellow eye, all that stuff. And it's between this fourth and fifth year when they start to find a mate and to establish a territory, which is pretty exciting. So as they're establishing a territory, that'll be between November to January. And that's when they'll also start building their nest. Like I mentioned, they return to their nest each year. They keep the same territory, site fidelity, all that jazz. So if they return to a nest they've already established, they'll likely keep adding to it, throw in a second bathroom or something, maybe a patio, who knows. But they'll really start renesting, relining the nest, making sure it's ready for young come January to March. And each pair of eagles has about 2 to 3 miles radius around their nest that is their territory. That amount of space gives them enough food. Usually the tree they're in gives them a good view of everything around them, and they're able to shelter from disturbances. So they wanted to find that really good habitat. And once they find it, they're going to defend it really well from other eagles, as well as hawks and things like that. It's not unheard of, but usually where there's such a big predator established, like a bald eagle, you're not going to have other large raptors or other eagles very close. So that 2 to 3 mile radius of the active nest is really just the eagles, which is pretty cool. So in Colorado, bald eagles are typically building their nests like that November when they're getting back to their site, building their nest through maybe end of March. But again, it's variable. They can begin laying eggs as early as February or as late as May and hatch for those birds, and care for the eaglets is usually March through June. And then birds typically start fledging in June through August. And here is another way to visualize that, just sort of see how variant it is, right? There's birds that are done incubating by the time others are fledging. So it really just depends, on the birds itself and a lot of external factors like available food or weather, things like that. So that's a little bit about their life cycle and how they move through the world. But that means right now, sort of end of March, the eagles are most likely incubating or sitting on their eggs or caring for newly hatched eaglets. And it's at this point that human disturbance can really affect the care they're able to give and the food they can catch and things like that. So while you're out watching eagles, don't do what anybody in this picture is doing. If there are large groups, lots of people, lots of noise, things like that, it can be really stressful for the birds. A good rule of thumb is if the birds react to you, like the birds know that you're there, you're too close. In that way, spotting scopes, binoculars, things like that can be your best friend. And if you can, it's not always glamorous, but you can stay in your car at a good distance and observe from there. That way it's just one car parked. They're not seeing the people inside getting all excited because they're seeing a bald eagle and things like that. But still allows you to see the eagle. And as you're looking for eagles and things like that, the eagles don't really care about property lines, but you should. If you're out and about, just be aware of whose property you're on and things like that. Don't want anybody trespassing just to see an eagle. So, like I mentioned, right now they're either incubating or caring for eaglets. By observing them, you can kind of tell what stage the eaglets are at or the eggs are at based on the parent's behavior. So if you're observing from a good distance and you see a white head sticking up in the middle of the nest, it's likely an adult incubating or sitting on the eggs or possibly warming up the little newly hatched eaglets. If both the parents or one parent is kind of sitting on the edge of the nest looking in, then there's probably growing eaglets that are taking their chance to kind of awkwardly walk around the nest and things like that. Or if you see a parent going back and forth with food, they're definitely feeding some young, which is pretty cool. And then if you see a bald eagle or a very large bird that doesn't have that white head, right? It's probably a branching bird or a fledgling bird. Um, and if you see one of those, you know, dark brown birds, a little bit mottily white, and it's on the ground, the parents are still around and still very much caring for that bird. You don't need to interfere. The parent knows it's on the ground. The parent knows to bring it food and will do its best to get it back into the nest. And like I mentioned, eagles, 2-inch talons, 100 or 1,000 pounds of pressure in that grip. You could get really, really hurt if you approach that bird or try to take care of it or bring it to a rehab facility or something like that. That bird doesn't need that help. It's doing all right, still by its nest. Parents are there. It'll be okay. And to help protect nesting, wintering, and sort of just the resident raptors that live here in Colorado. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, or CPW, has a lot of really good recommendations on buffer zones and where they'll allow things to happen in proximity to the nest. So on all new building or things like that, like mining, housing, commercial buildings, highways, trails, any sort of building project that could affect bald eagles, they consult on that. So right now, or December 1st through July 31st, so really covering that reestablishment of territory all the way to when most of the eagles should have fledged. There is a no surface occupancy rule, meaning that permanent things on the landscapes like houses or things like that cannot be built within a 4th mile of an active nest site. And they also recommend that no human activity occurs within a 1/2 mile radius to that nest. And CPW provides buffer zone recommendations for all different kinds of nesting raptors. I'll make sure we send out that document. It's a pretty interesting read. But their guidelines are a lot more extensive than the U.S. Fish and Wildlife bald eagle guidelines. And that's because we have such great habitat for nesting eagles here, right? We have a lot of trees, a lot of lone trees and cottonwoods that they can nest in, sort of see the whole environment from their perch and go from there. Bird Conservancy helps advise on these guidelines. Bird Conservancy helps advise on these guidelines by reporting data based on the number of nesting eagles and successful fledges, which is pretty cool. So as of last year, we monitored 150 plus nest. I think it's closer to 180. And of that, about 125 of those nests were active, and 100 nests produced at least one fledged eagle, which is really exciting. So living with eagles in your area is super cool. They're so much fun to see. It's just so inspiring to see them soaring or see them sitting in a tree all stoically. But they're also, a big responsibility to make sure these birds can continue to thrive. So making sure that we can limit disturbances, making sure you're not riding your ATV next to a active nest or things like that. Or if you see someone disrupting a nest, you can report it to CPW. But really, you can really enjoy watching them. You now know a little bit more, so you can interpret their behavior. You can see them grow, see the parents incubate, watch them awkwardly try and branch, and grow through those awkward teenage years, which is pretty cool. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed sharing the joy of eagles with you. And if you like what you heard today, please keep in mind that gifts from individuals like you, along with businesses and foundations, help us fill critical funding gaps and provide matching revenue to several of our federal and state sources. You can help keep Bird Conservancy scientists, biologists, educators, and ecologists like me working to advance bird conservation from Montana down to northern Mexico. So again, thank you. I really hope you enjoyed learning about eagles with me today. We are offering bird walks at Bar Lake State Park. And there's 2 eagle nests within the state park, and they had about 60 eagles wintering there this year, which is pretty cool. But we'll be offering walks through the spring, and you can find more information on that on our website. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, April 8th at 11 with Meredith McBurney, our bander, talking about spring migration. Again, thank you. I'll stick around and answer any questions you may have. I have a lot more to share about eagles and would love to keep rambling, but I want to make sure I address all of your questions. So thank you so much.
Awesome.
Tyler, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey. I feel like I know a lot about bald eagles because we work for this organization, but I still learned something with this presentation. So thank you for that.
You're so welcome.
We do have a quick question.
Of course.
We're wondering, 50 years ago, do you know how many eagles there were in Colorado?
That is a great question. I know that the first bald eagle's nest was found in Colorado in the 70s. And in, let's see, I don't know the exact number, but I know that in the 60s, there were only 417 active nests in the United States. And as of 1995, they were changed from endangered to threatened. And as of 2007, they were delisted as threatened. They're still a species of special concern right now, but I don't know the total number of eagles we have right now. I know during the summer, there's somewhere between 400 to 600, so probably around there, but much more than just the 2 that were here in the 70s, right? So I feel like they've grown quite a bit in Colorado, and they really thrive in the habitat we have here. I know that was kind of a rambly answer, but I hope it answered your question.
Yeah, and I feel like bald eagles are such a great conservation success story because of, they were dying out with the DDT, and in the last 50 years, they've really made a great comeback, which I think is awesome. And it's also a reason why Bird Conservancy, why we are an organization, was because of that nesting pair out at Bar Lake back in 1988.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyler. I always forget about that.
It's a fun fact of Bird Conservancy for the day.
Right.
But it looks like all the other questions were answered in the chat.
Okay.
And it looks like there's no more coming in. So thank you, Kelsey, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar.
Yes, thank you so much.